My name is Michael Anderson, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of man people describe with words like reliable, steady, and painfully ordinary. I was born in Ohio, raised in a middle-class household where showing up on time mattered more than showing off, and I carried that mindset into adulthood. At 32 years old, I worked as a senior data analyst for a regional logistics firm in Chicago, earning a respectable but unglamorous income. I wore off-the-rack suits, drove a paid-off sedan, and believed deeply in building things slowly. At the time this story begins, I thought that kind of life was enough to love, enough to be respected, and enough to keep the woman I had built my world around. Her name was Samantha Reed, and she was anything but ordinary. Samantha was 30 when we met, radiant in the way people are when they believe the world owes them more. She worked in luxury brand marketing, surrounded by champagne launches, rooftop parties, and influencers who spoke in numbers, followers, impressions, net worth. We met at a charity networking event, ironically one I attended because my company had donated unused logistics software. She told me she admired how grounded I was, how refreshing it felt to talk to someone who wasn't constantly selling an image. I believed her, and that belief would cost me more than I understood at the time. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. We moved fast, the way people do when infatuation disguises incompatibility. By the time I was 26 and she was 24, we got married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and confused family members who thought we were rushing. I told myself love didn't need spectacle. Samantha smiled through the vows, but even then, I remember noticing how her eyes lingered on other weddings, other lives, ones that looked louder and richer than ours. Still, for 4 years we tried to make it work, until ambition and dissatisfaction pulled us apart. By the time this story truly begins, we were no longer husband and wife, just a couple clinging to a familiar rhythm, calling each other boyfriend and girlfriend to make the failure feel smaller. The night she finally said it out loud is burned into my memory with cruel clarity. We were sitting in a minimalist restaurant she loved, one where the menu didn't list prices and the waiter judged your watch before pouring water. She looked across the table at me, exhaled slowly, and told me I was a good man, but not the kind of man who fit the life she wanted anymore. She said my routine bored her, my ambitions were too safe, and my idea of success felt small compared to the room she wanted to walk into. Then came the sentence that would echo in my head for weeks. Michael, you're just too ordinary for my lifestyle. I didn't argue. That's the part people always find strange when I tell this story. I didn't raise my voice or list my sacrifices. I didn't remind her of the years I supported her career moves or the nights I stayed up fixing presentations she would later present as her own. I simply nodded, paid the bill, and walked her to a rideshare like a courteous stranger. Inside, something shifted. Not anger, not sadness exactly, but a quiet recalibration. For the first time, I realized how much of myself I had compressed to fit into someone else's definition of worthy. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped doing that. What Samantha never took seriously, what she laughed off as a hobby, was the company I had been building quietly on the side. For nearly 3 years, I had spent my nights working on a predictive analytics platform designed to optimize supply chains using real-time data and machine learning. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't photograph well for social media, but it solved expensive problems. I funded it myself, coded the early versions, and tested it with small manufacturers who couldn't afford the enterprise solutions dominating the market. To Samantha, it was just Michael being Michael, another example of me playing it safe instead of chasing venture capital glamour. In the weeks after our breakup, I didn't spiral the way people expected. I stopped attending events I never enjoyed, canceled subscriptions I didn't need, and focused entirely on the work I had postponed for too long. While Samantha documented her new life online, new restaurants, new people, new captions about growth, I was in my apartment refining algorithms and preparing for meetings that actually mattered. I slept less, thought more, and for the first time in years, I felt aligned with myself. Ordinary, I realized, was just a label people used when they couldn't see the trajectory yet. The call that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday morning. A venture capital firm I had pitched months earlier, one Samantha had dismissed as too niche, wanted to talk again. Then another followed. Then another. Within 14 days, my small, ignored platform turned into the subject of serious acquisition discussions. Contracts moved faster than emotions ever had. Numbers I once wrote in notebooks were now being spoken aloud in conference rooms. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post. I just worked, aware that momentum, once earned, doesn't need noise to prove it exists. I didn't know it then, but the cover photo had already been scheduled. The headline hadn't been written yet, but it would include my name, my company, and a word no one had ever used to describe me before. As I stood in my apartment that night, city lights reflecting off rain-streaked windows, I thought about the man Samantha had left behind at that restaurant. Ordinary, she had called him. I smiled, not because she was wrong, but because she had no idea how temporary that description was about to be. The first thing I learned after Samantha left was how quiet life becomes when you stop performing for someone else's expectations. The apartment felt larger, not emptier, as if space itself had been waiting for me to claim it. I reorganized my days with the precision of a man who finally understood the value of his time. Mornings were for strategy, afternoons for product refinement, and nights for investor calls that stretched across time zones. I was still Michael Anderson, same name, same address, but internally I was becoming someone sharper, more deliberate. There was no dramatic montage, no overnight transformation, just disciplined consistency compounding in ways that don't look impressive until suddenly, they are. Within a month, my calendar stopped feeling like something I controlled and started feeling like something I survived. Venture firms requested demos. Supply chain executives asked questions that proved they finally understood the scale of what I'd built. And legal teams began circling with language that made everything feel very real. I hired my first 2 employees, both older than me, both far more experienced in areas I needed. Writing those offer letters felt surreal, like proof that I hadn't imagined the last few years of quiet effort. This wasn't a side project anymore. It was a company with momentum, gravity, and a future that refused to be ignored. Occasionally, Samantha crossed my mind, not as a wound but as a reference point. I noticed how often people underestimated what they didn't immediately understand, how quickly they dismissed patience as a lack of ambition. I remembered her words clearly, especially the confidence with which she'd spoken them, as if she were stating a universal truth rather than a personal preference. There was no hatred in my reflection on her, only clarity. She wanted spectacle before substance, applause before foundation. I wanted durability. The irony was that the latter almost always produces a former, just not on someone else's timeline. The first press mention came quietly, buried in an industry newsletter most people skimmed. It highlighted my platform as a disruptive force in mid-market logistics optimization, a phrase I reread several times before letting myself believe it referred to my work. Then came a trade publication interview request, followed by a podcast appearance that somehow led to 3 more. Each time I spoke, I told the truth plainly, without exaggeration or polish. I talked about inefficiencies, data blind spots, and the cost of pretending problems didn't exist. People listened, not because I was flashy, but because what I said made sense. One evening, after a 14-hour day, I scrolled through social media for the first time in weeks and saw Samantha's profile surface uninvited. She looked radiant, framed by a skyline bar, arm looped casually through someone else's. The caption talked about alignment and knowing your worth. I didn't feel the sting I expected. Instead, I felt detached, like watching a rerun of a show I'd already outgrown. For the first time, I realized I didn't need her validation or regret to confirm my progress. The work itself was enough, and that realization was more empowering than any apology could have been. As negotiations intensified, so did the pressure. Lawyers debated clauses that could define the next decade of my life. Advisors warned me about selling too early, about holding on too long, about the danger of becoming emotionally attached to numbers on a page. I listened carefully, weighing every option, remembering how easily people had once dismissed my vision. When the final offer arrived, it wasn't the highest number on the table, but it was the one that preserved control, scale, and integrity. I signed with steady hands, aware that this wasn't an ending but a beginning with sharper consequences. The announcement went public on a Thursday morning. My inbox flooded, my phone buzzed nonstop, and my name trended briefly in a corner of the internet I'd never paid attention to before. Industry leaders commented. Former colleagues reached out, and people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly remembered my number. Amid the noise, I received an email from a major business magazine requesting a feature interview. I skimmed it once, then again, until one line stopped me cold. They wanted to discuss leadership, restraint, and the rise of an unlikely founder. Unlikely, I thought, was just another word for underestimated. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, studying the same face that had once been labeled ordinary and found it unchanged. No new confidence glowed in my eyes. No cinematic transformation had taken place. What had changed was invisible but undeniable. I knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of, regardless of who chose to walk beside me. Somewhere across the city, Samantha was living the life she'd chosen, convinced she'd made the right call. I didn't resent her for it. I simply understood, with calm certainty, that our definitions of extraordinary had never been the same. And soon, the world would notice that too. The day the magazine interview took place, I treated it like any other work obligation, which in hindsight was the most honest reflection of who I'd become. I didn't buy a news shoot or rehearse clever sound bites in the mirror. I showed up early, laptop under my arm, fresh from a call with my engineering lead about deployment timelines. The journalist expected someone louder. I could tell by the way she scanned the room when I walked in, as if waiting for the real subject to arrive. When she realized it was me, she smiled politely, adjusted her recorder, and asked me to tell her about my journey, that word people love to use when they want struggle packaged neatly for inspiration. I told her the truth, even when it wasn't cinematic. I talked about years of being overlooked in meetings, about pitching ideas that were met with nods and no follow-up, about building something valuable without anyone clapping for it. I explained how boring consistency often looks from the outside, how discipline rarely photographs well, and how most breakthroughs are the result of quiet endurance rather than explosive genius. As I spoke, I noticed her posture change, her questions becoming sharper, more curious. She stopped interrupting. She started listening. That, I realized, was a real power shift, not money or recognition, but commanding attention without demanding it. After the interview, life accelerated in ways I couldn't fully control. Conferences invited me to speak, boards requested advisory roles, and my company's valuation became public knowledge in circles I'd never been part of before. Strangers recognized me in elevators and airport lounges, not with fanfare but with a kind of respectful curiosity. I was still wearing simple clothes, still avoiding excess, but people leaned in when I spoke now. The same voice that had once been dismissed as too cautious was suddenly labeled measured and strategic. Nothing about my words had changed, only the context in which people heard them. It was during this period that Samantha reached out for the first time since the breakup. The message was short, casual, and carefully neutral, as if she were testing the temperature before stepping closer. She congratulated me on the recent news, said she'd seen my name everywhere, and added a line about how proud she was of me. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I finally understood the asymmetry of the moment. Months earlier, she'd spoken from a position of judgment. Now, she was speaking from a distance she hadn't anticipated. I replied politely, thanked her, and wished her well. No bitterness, no subtext, no invitation. When she suggested catching up sometime, I declined without explanation. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense people expect, but it was something quieter and far more final. I no longer needed her to see my value, because I wasn't offering it for evaluation anymore. That boundary, once drawn, felt immovable. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to her choices. I was honoring my own. The Forbes call came 2 weeks later, and I almost missed it because I was reviewing financial forecasts. The editor spoke calmly, professionally, as if inviting someone to be featured on the cover was an everyday occurrence. She explained the angle they wanted to take, the rise of founders who didn't fit the stereotypical mold, leaders who built scalable impact without spectacle. When she said my name in the same sentence as that theme, I felt a brief, unfamiliar tightness in my chest, not disbelief, but recognition. This was a narrative I'd been living long before anyone noticed. The photo shoot was surreal in its simplicity. No private jets or glass offices, just me standing in natural light, hands relaxed, expression neutral. The photographer told me not to smile too much, said confidence didn't need exaggeration. I thought about that later, how the world often mistakes volume for certainty and extravagance for success. As the camera clicked, I didn't think about Samantha or anyone else who had doubted me. I thought about the nights I almost quit, the weekends I coded alone, the patience it took to keep going without reassurance. That was a story written across my face, whether people could read it or not. When the issue finally hit newsstands, my phone exploded in ways that felt almost invasive. Family members cried, old classmates reached out with awe, and business contacts spoke to me with a reverence that bordered on absurd. I bought a copy myself, stood in line like anyone else, and stared at the cover longer than I expected to. Seeing my name there didn't make me feel superior. It made me feel anchored. This wasn't a peak. It was a marker, proof that my trajectory had been real all along. Later that evening, as messages continued pouring in, I received another text from Samantha. This one was longer, less composed. She said she wished she believed in me more, said she hadn't realized what I was building, said she hoped I understood her perspective back then. I read it once and set the phone down. There was nothing left to clarify. Her words came too late, not because I was successful, but because I was complete without her acknowledgement. That distinction mattered more than she could know. As I closed the blinds and sat alone in my living room, Forbes magazine resting unopened on the table, I thought about the man I had been when she called me ordinary. He hadn't been weak or small, just unseen. The difference now wasn't that I'd become extraordinary. It was that I no longer needed anyone else to define the word for me. Fame, I learned quickly, is not a celebration. It's a negotiation. The week after the Forbes issue dropped, my life became a series of controlled interruptions. Every conversation had an agenda. Every compliment carried curiosity about what could be extracted next. I was invited to dinners where people listened politely until the word valuation appeared, and then suddenly everyone leaned forward. I navigated it carefully, reminding myself that visibility didn't equal obligation. Just because the world had finally noticed me didn't mean it was entitled to my time, my trust, or my story beyond what I chose to give. That restraint, forged long before success, became my greatest advantage. What surprised me most was how differently people interpreted my rise depending on when they'd entered my life. Those who knew me before saw continuity. They recognized the same discipline, the same quiet stubbornness. Those who met me after the cover saw transformation. They spoke as if I'd been hiding brilliance instead of patiently building it. I didn't correct either version. Both were incomplete, and neither needed my clarification. Success often invites mythology, and I had no interest in feeding it. The truth was less dramatic and far more instructive. I hadn't changed direction. I'd simply stayed on it long enough for others to catch up. My company, now operating at a scale I once only modeled hypothetically, demanded even more of me. Growth introduces complexity, and complexity punishes ego. I spent long hours aligning teams, reinforcing culture, and making decisions whose consequences wouldn't be visible for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that the more successful I became, the less room there was for impulsive behavior. This wasn't the life Samantha had envisioned. No constant parties, no performative luxury. It was responsibility layered on responsibility, purpose reinforced by pressure. And I loved it, not because it impressed anyone, but because it fit me. I ran into Samantha unexpectedly at a private industry event several months later. There were no cameras, no curated entrances, just two people navigating the same space with very different internal weather. She looked polished, confident, and slightly uncertain in a way I hadn't seen before. When our eyes met, She smiled instinctively, then hesitated, as if recalculating. We exchanged pleasantries, spoke briefly about work, about mutual acquaintances, about nothing that mattered. What struck me wasn't her discomfort, but my neutrality. There was no surge of triumph, no lingering resentment. The imbalance she once held no longer existed, and without it, the past lost its emotional charge. Later that night, I reflected on how much power people unknowingly surrender when they define worth externally. Samantha hadn't been cruel. She'd been honest about her values. She wanted acceleration without incubation, visibility without patience. I wanted something else entirely, even if I hadn't known how to articulate it back then. Our relationship hadn't failed because one of us was wrong. It failed because our timelines and tolerances didn't align. That realization stripped the story of villainy and replaced it with responsibility. I own my choices now, fully, without needing to frame them against someone else's mistakes. As the months passed, I became more intentional about privacy. I declined interviews that felt redundant, reduced my public appearances, and redirected attention toward initiatives that mattered to me: mentorship programs, equitable hiring pipelines, long-term research funding. The irony of being more selective after becoming more visible wasn't lost on me. Ordinary, I realized, isn't about scale or income. It's about living reactively, allowing other people's expectations to dictate your pace and priorities. I had lived that way once, mistaking accommodation for love and silence for humility. I wouldn't repeat that mistake. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly projections, I came across an old notebook buried in a drawer. Inside were early sketches of the platform, messy diagrams, half-formed equations, notes written during lunch breaks and late nights. On the back page, I'd scribbled a sentence years earlier, almost as a joke: build something that doesn't need applause. I sat with that line longer than expected, realizing how thoroughly it had guided me without my conscious awareness. Applause had come eventually, but it was never the fuel. The work was. The clarity was. The refusal to quit quietly was. News travels differently when it's no longer chasing you. I heard through mutual contacts that Samantha was engaged, that her life had taken the shape she once described so confidently. I felt no urge to verify, no curiosity about details. Her chapter in my life was complete, not because I'd surpassed her expectations, but because I'd outgrown the need to be measured by them. That distinction mattered. Revenge, I discovered, isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about proving yourself right, on your own terms, in your own time. On the anniversary of the Forbes issue, I didn't repost the cover or mark the occasion publicly. I spent the day in meetings, refining strategy, preparing for challenges still invisible to most. That night, alone in my apartment, I looked out over the city and thought about how easily my story could have ended differently if I had accepted the label she gave me as a verdict instead of a misunderstanding. Ordinary had never been my limitation. It had been my camouflage. And now that it was gone, not much else needed to be said. By the time people began calling my story inspirational, I had learned to flinch at the word, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was incomplete. Inspiration focuses on outcomes, on covers and headlines, while quietly skipping over the cost of sustained focus and the loneliness of long conviction. My days had settled into a rhythm that looked deceptively calm from the outside but demanded constant recalibration beneath the surface. I was no longer just responsible for an idea or a product. I was responsible for people's livelihoods, for decisions that rippled outward into markets and families I would never meet. That weight doesn't inflate the ego. It humbles it, if you're paying attention. As my professional life stabilized into something formidable, my personal life forced me to confront a different kind of reckoning. Success is a way of exposing patterns you once ignored, especially in relationships. I realized how often I had mistaken emotional availability for self-erasure, how frequently I prioritized harmony over honesty. In my marriage years earlier, when I was 26 and still learning who I was allowed to become, I thought compromise meant shrinking my ambitions to make room for someone else's vision. Now, at 34, I understood that real partnership doesn't require you to disappear. It requires alignment, not admiration, respect, not tolerance. People began approaching me differently in romantic contexts. 2. Conversations felt more measured, more strategic, as if my net worth had become a personality trait. I found myself stepping back, observing how quickly curiosity turned into expectation, how often admiration skipped straight to entitlement. It forced me to become deliberate in ways I'd never needed to be before, to protect not just my time but my clarity. I wasn't looking for someone impressed by my trajectory. I was looking for someone who would have walked beside me before the destination became obvious. That standard eliminated most options quickly, and I was strangely grateful for that. One evening, after a long board meeting, I sat alone in a quiet restaurant and thought about Samantha again, not with longing, but with perspective. She had been honest about what she wanted, even if the delivery had been harsh. In some ways, she had done me a favor by refusing to romanticize my potential. Her dismissal had forced me to confront whether I believed in myself without an audience. I wondered briefly if she ever questioned her choice, not because of my success, but because of the patience she traded away. Then I let the thought go. Her internal dialogue was no longer my concern. What surprised me most was how little the external validation ultimately mattered once I'd built internal coherence. The Forbes cover didn't motivate me to work harder. It challenged me to work cleaner, to strip away distractions that success tends to invite. I became ruthless about priorities, about saying no, about distinguishing between opportunities that expanded impact and those that simply inflated perception. That discipline wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. The company grew steadily, sustainably, and with a resilience that couldn't be undone by market noise or shifting sentiment. I started mentoring younger founders quietly, without announcements or branding. I recognized versions of myself in their questions, in the way they hesitated to claim ambition for fear of appearing arrogant. I told them what I wish someone had told me earlier, that being underestimated is only dangerous if you internalize it, that ordinary effort compounded over time will outperform sporadic brilliance every time. Watching them recalibrate their own narratives reminded me how close I'd once come to abandoning mine. It also reinforced how responsibility doesn't end with personal success. It expands with it. There was a moment, late one night, when I stood in my office alone and replayed that dinner conversation from years ago in my head. I remembered the tone of Samantha's voice, the finality she thought she held, the certainty with which she labeled me. For the first time, I didn't feel defensive or reflective. I felt appreciative, not of the pain, but of the clarity it had triggered. That sentence had been a line in the sand. On one side was a life lived according to someone else's appetite. On the other was a life built deliberately, patiently, without needing permission. As I prepared for the next phase of expansion, negotiating partnerships that would define the next decade, I felt a calm confidence settle in, a kind that doesn't announce itself. I wasn't chasing redemption or validation anymore. I wasn't proving a point. I was simply continuing the work, aware that the most meaningful revenge isn't spectacle or confrontation. It's becoming so grounded in who you are that the people who once doubted you no longer factor into your decisions at all. And in that quiet certainty, I realized the story was approaching its truest conclusion. The strange thing about reaching a point you once fantasized about is how quickly it becomes ordinary, not in the dismissive sense, but in the human one. The life I was living now, the one people whispered about or used as shorthand for success, had settled into something stable, demanding, and quietly fulfilling. I woke up early, exercised discipline instead of urgency, and made decisions rooted in long horizons rather than short applause. There were no victory laps left to run, no one left to impress. The absence of that pressure felt like freedom, and freedom, I learned, is far more valuable than recognition. On a crisp morning not long after my 35th birthday, I was invited to speak at a closed-door leadership forum. No press, no streaming, just a room full of people who had built things and lost things and were honest enough to talk about both. When it was my turn, I didn't mention magazine covers or valuation milestones. I talked about restraint, about how easy it is to abandon patience when someone else mocks it, about how dangerous it is to confuse speed with direction. I watched heads nod, not because my story was exceptional, but because it was familiar. Most people don't fail from lack of talent. They fail from absorbing someone else's definition of enough. After the event, a young founder approached me privately. He said his partner had recently told him he was thinking too small, that his vision lacked ambition. He asked how I'd known when to walk away and when to double down. I told him the truth, the same truth I had lived rather than learned. You don't always know. You choose, and then you live with that choice honestly. If the criticism sharpens your resolve instead of shrinking it, you're probably on the right path. If it makes you abandon your core just to be accepted, you're already losing. He thanked me, and I recognized the look in his eyes, the moment where self-trust begins to override doubt. That evening, alone again, I thought about Samantha for the last time with any emotional weight. Not as an antagonist or a regret, but as a catalyst. She had seen a version of me that was unfinished and decided it wasn't worth waiting for. That was her right. What mattered was that I hadn't let her assessment calcify into identity. The danger had never been her words. It had been my willingness, back then, to believe them. Growth began the moment I stopped outsourcing my self-worth to someone whose priorities didn't match mine. I understood now why revenge stories are often misunderstood. People imagine revenge as a dramatic reversal, a public reckoning that forces a doubter to acknowledge their mistake. But real revenge is quieter and far more personal. It's waking up one day and realizing you no longer replay the conversation that once haunted you. It's recognizing that the person who dismissed you has become irrelevant not because you surpassed them, but because you surpassed the need to be measured by them at all. That kind of closure doesn't trend, but it lasts. My life today is not extravagant by design. I still live in the same city, still prefer quiet dinners to loud celebrations, still find satisfaction in solving problems no one sees. The difference is that now, when someone calls me ordinary, it doesn't land as an insult. Ordinary effort, applied consistently, built everything I stand on. Ordinary patience carried me through doubt. Ordinary discipline outlasted extraordinary noise. If anything, being ordinary turned out to be my greatest advantage in a world addicted to shortcuts. I never reached out to Samantha again, and she never reached out to me. Our stories diverged cleanly, without collision or reconciliation. That, too, felt right. Some chapters aren't meant to overlap indefinitely. They exist to push you forward, not to follow you into the future. When I look back now, I don't see a woman who underestimated me. I see a moment that forced me to finally see myself clearly. So when people ask how it feels to have my name associated with success, influence, and leadership, I tell them something simple. I tell them it feels quiet, grounded, earned. The loudest voices in my life no longer come from critics or admirers, but from my own sense of direction. And that is the ending no one sees coming. The realization that the greatest revenge isn't being seen as extraordinary by the world, but knowing, without doubt, that you were never ordinary to begin with. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.